What if I told you that a wrong turn by one driver started a war that killed 20 million people? Or that a company literally invented the future, then locked it in a drawer so they could keep selling the past? Humans have made some decisions so jaw-droppingly, face-palmingly, spectacularly stupid that they changed the entire course of history. And we found 49 of them. Stay till the end. Number 49 will make you question everything you thought you knew about power. 1. Napoleon Bonaparte had already conquered most of Europe, so naturally, his next big brain move was to invade Russia in the middle of winter. This man looked at a calendar, saw December, looked at Russia, and said, yes, this is fine. He sent over 600,000 soldiers marching into negative 30-degree temperatures with no proper winter gear, no food supply plan, and absolutely zero backup strategy. Russia just kept retreating and burning their own crops. Napoleon basically handed his entire army to frostbite and starvation and lost 400,000 men without Russia even trying that hard. 2. A Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson literally invented the digital camera inside Kodak's own lab in 1975 and handed them the future on a silver platter. The executives looked at it, understood exactly what it meant, and then decided to lock it in a drawer because they were too busy counting film roll money. They sat on a world-changing invention for decades just to protect their existing business. Then digital photography exploded anyway, took over the entire world, and Kodak went completely bankrupt in 2012. They killed themselves trying to hide the thing they built with their own hands. 3. Doctors in the 1840s were killing their own patients and had absolutely no idea because nobody was washing their hands. A Hungarian doctor named Ignác Semmelweis figured it out, ran the numbers, proved it with actual data, and told every doctor in Vienna that hand washing would save lives. The entire medical community looked at his evidence and chose to be offended instead. They laughed at him, kicked him out of hospitals, and kept killing patients with dirty hands. Semmelweis died in an asylum. Years later, science proved he was completely right the whole time. 4. King George III was sitting on the throne in London, doing king things, when his American colonies politely asked him to stop taxing them without giving them any say in the matter. George heard their concerns, thought about it carefully, and then taxed them even harder just to make a point. And this man had an entire continent of loyal subjects and turned them into furious revolutionaries through sheer stubbornness. The colonies got so fed up they started a whole revolution, built an entirely new country, and America was born purely because one king refused to stop being difficult. 5. Someone invented social media, handed every human being on Earth a device to share their every thought, feeling, meal, and opinion with strangers at all hours of the day, and then acted completely shocked when everyone became miserable. The engineers who built these platforms knew from their own internal research that it was damaging mental health, increasing anxiety, and making people angrier by the minute. They kept building it anyway because the engagement numbers looked great. Humanity collectively handed over their peace of mind, their attention, and their sleep schedules in exchange for arguing with strangers about things that do not matter. 6. The British Army during the Crimean War had a simple military problem to solve, and their solution was to send 600 cavalry soldiers charging at full speed directly into an open valley surrounded by Russian artillery on 3 sides. The order was confusing, the commanders argued about it, and somehow the final decision was yes, let us ride horses straight into cannons. The soldiers knew it was suicidal and charged anyway because that is what you did in 1854. 2/3 of them were killed or wounded in minutes. Military historians are still shaking their heads about this one. 7. In the year 2000, Netflix was a tiny little DVD mail company that walked into Blockbuster's office and offered to sell the whole business for just $50 million. Blockbuster's CEO sat across the table, listened to the entire pitch, and then laughed them out of the room. He genuinely thought it was a joke. Blockbuster was making billions renting movies and charging late fees and saw absolutely no reason to worry about some small mail DVD startup. 10 years later, Netflix was worth billions. Streaming had taken over the entire entertainment industry, and Blockbuster had gone completely bankrupt. 8. Scientists figured out in the 1920s that adding lead to gasoline was genuinely poisonous to human beings. They had the studies, they had the evidence, made workers at the very factories producing it were getting sick and dying. The oil and automobile industries looked at all of that information and decided to add it to every car's fuel supply across the entire country anyway for decades. People were breathing in lead fumes from car exhaust constantly for over 50 years. It lowered IQs, caused serious health problems across entire generations, and the industry spent years paying scientists to pretend everything was fine. 9. America looked at alcohol in 1920 and decided the entire country needed to stop drinking immediately by making it completely illegal overnight. What could possibly go wrong? Within months of prohibition starting, organized crime exploded across every major American city. Gangsters like Al Capone became fabulously wealthy and incredibly powerful because they were the only ones still selling what everyone wanted. What the government had essentially handed criminal organizations a monopoly on one of the most popular products in human history. Prohibition lasted 13 years, created modern organized crime, and when it finally ended, Americans went straight back to drinking anyway. 10. Humans looked at forests, which were doing an absolutely essential job of keeping the planet alive, cleaning the air and regulating the climate, and decided to cut down 80% of them to make room for farms, in cities and furniture. For centuries, people just kept chopping with no plan and no concern about consequences. Then temperatures started rising, weather patterns went completely haywire, floods got worse, droughts got longer, and scientists started explaining very patiently that trees were actually important. The response was to hold international meetings, make promises, and then continue cutting down trees at roughly the same rate. 11. In 1667, the Dutch sat down with the English to negotiate a peace treaty and walked away genuinely proud of themselves because they had secured Run Island, a tiny speck of land in Indonesia that grew nutmeg. In exchange, they handed over a small, unremarkable piece of land the English had been occupying called Manhattan. The Dutch thought they had absolutely won that deal because nutmeg was worth a fortune at the time. That tiny, unremarkable piece of land the Dutch gave away is now the most valuable real estate on planet Earth and home to New York City. 12. Polaroid invented instant photography, built an entire empire around it, and became one of the most beloved camera brands in American history. Then digital photography started showing up, and every single sign pointed toward the future being completely digital. Polaroid looked at all those signs and decided their customers would never abandon physical film because people loved the instant photo experience too much. They kept doubling down on film, refused to seriously invest in digital technology, and watched the entire photography world move on without them. By 2001, Polaroid had filed for bankruptcy, killed by their own stubborn loyalty to the past. 13. In the 1940s and 1950s, scientists and government officials decided that DDT was so safe and so effective at killing insects that they would spray it directly onto children at public beaches, schools, and community events. There are actual photographs of kids playing in clouds of DDT mist, while adults stood nearby looking completely relaxed about the whole situation. Scientists who raised concerns were ignored or dismissed. DDT turned out to be catastrophically harmful to wildlife, ecosystems, and human health. It wiped out entire bird populations and took decades of banning and cleanup efforts to start reversing the damage it caused. 14. After World War I finally ended, the winning nations sat down in Paris and decided the absolute best way to ensure lasting peace in Europe was to punish Germany so severely that the entire country collapsed into poverty, humiliation, and rage. They took Germany's territory, crushed its economy, banned its military, and handed the German people a document called the Treaty of Versailles that essentially blamed them for everything. Economists like John Maynard Keynes warned immediately that this was a catastrophic mistake. Nobody listened. 20 years later, a furious and humiliated Germany handed power to Adolf Hitler and started World War II. 15. Sometime in the 17th century, someone decided that the most fashionable thing a human being could wear on their feet was a shoe with a completely impractical elevated heel that made walking difficult, caused chronic back pain, and served absolutely no useful purpose whatsoever. Instead of looking at this idea and saying no thank you, society embraced it completely. Centuries passed. Entire medical fields dedicated to foot and spine problems emerged directly because of heeled footwear. Humans kept wearing them anyway because fashion demanded it. Today, people still voluntarily strap uncomfortable heeled shoes onto their feet daily and call it a choice they enjoy making. 16. Medieval Italian engineers and city planners looked at a soft, unstable, constantly flooding lagoon in northeastern Italy and said this is the perfect place to build a major city. They drove wooden stakes into the mud, constructed an entire city on top of water, and called it Venice. For centuries, it was considered a marvel of human achievement. The problem is the city has been slowly sinking into that same lagoon ever since it was built. Today, Venice floods regularly, buildings are deteriorating, and the entire city is genuinely at risk of disappearing underwater, which was completely predictable from literally day one of construction. 17. Coca-Cola in 1985 had the single most successful and beloved beverage formula in human history, a drink that hundreds of millions of people were completely loyal to and deeply emotional about. Their response to this enviable situation was to throw the entire formula away and replace it with something nobody asked for called New Coke. The public reaction was not mixed, it was furious. People hoarded original Coke cans, called the company in outrage, and treated it like a national emergency. Well, Coca-Cola brought the original formula back within 79 days, in one of the most embarrassing corporate reversals in American business history. 18. In the late 1950s, a drug called thalidomide was prescribed to pregnant women across Europe, Canada, and other countries to help with morning sickness, and it was marketed as completely safe with zero side effects. Doctors handed it out freely and confidently. What followed was one of the worst pharmaceutical disasters in history, as thousands of babies were born with severe limb deformities directly caused by the drug their mothers were told was harmless. An FDA reviewer named Francis Kelsey blocked its approval in America, saving the country from the worst of it, while the rest of the world learned a catastrophic lesson about drug testing. 19. The CIA in 1961 came up with a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba that involved training about 1,400 Cuban exiles, landing them on a beach called Bay of Pigs, and expecting the Cuban population to spontaneously rise up and join them in a revolution. The plan required everything to go perfectly, had no real backup strategy, and was based on assumptions that turned out to be completely wrong. The invasion lasted 3 days before collapsing entirely. The exiles were captured. As America was humiliated on the world stage and Castro came out of it more popular and more powerful than before the whole thing started. 20. At some point in recent human history, someone engineered the perfect chair. So comfortable and supportive that sitting in it for 8 to 12 hours straight became not just possible, but the default setting for modern life. Office jobs exploded, screens multiplied, and the average American started spending the majority of their waking hours completely motionless in a seat. Doctors began linking prolonged sitting to heart disease, obesity, back problems, and early death. Entire fitness industries worth billions emerged specifically to fix the damage caused by sitting too much. Humanity built the most comfortable chair possible and then slowly broke their bodies living in it. 21. The Titanic was the largest and most expensive ship ever built in 1912, and the company behind it was so confident in its engineering that they sent it across the Atlantic on its very first voyage with only enough lifeboats to carry about half the people on board. The thinking was that the ship was so advanced it would never actually sink, so why waste deck space on extra lifeboats? The Titanic hit an iceberg on its first trip. Ice sank in under 3 hours, and over 1,500 people died largely because the people running the operation were too proud of the ship to prepare for the obvious possibility that something could go wrong. 22. Xerox in the 1970s had a research lab in California called Park that was quietly inventing the entire future of personal computing. They created the graphical user interface, the mouse, the desktop computer concept, and basically everything that would define modern technology. Well, now then, Steve Jobs visited the lab, saw everything Xerox had built, and walked out with all of it. Xerox let him in, showed him their most valuable innovations, and received some Apple stock in return. Apple used those ideas to build the Macintosh and eventually became the most valuable company in history, while Xerox went on to become primarily known for making printers. 23. Engineers and government officials in Japan made the decision to build the Fukushima nuclear power plant directly on one of the most seismically active coastlines on the planet, in a country that experiences more earthquakes than almost anywhere else on Earth. Safety reports warned about the risks of tsunamis overwhelming the facility, and those warnings were noted, filed, and largely ignored because building the plant there was cheaper and more convenient. In 2011, a massive earthquake triggered a tsunami that hit the plant exactly as the warnings described, caused 3 reactor meltdowns, and forced the evacuation of over 150,000 people from surrounding areas. 24. In 2003, the United States government launched a full-scale military invasion of Iraq, committing hundreds of thousands of troops and hundreds of billions of dollars, based on the central claim that Iraq was hiding weapons of mass destruction that posed an immediate threat to global security. Intelligence agencies had doubts, weapons inspectors on the ground had doubts, multiple allied countries had serious doubts. The invasion happened anyway. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found because they did not exist. The war lasted nearly 9 years, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and destabilized an entire region for decades afterward. 25. Our early humans discovered fire at some point hundreds of thousands of years ago, and it was genuinely one of the greatest breakthroughs in the history of the species. Fire meant warmth, cooked food, protection from predators, and light in the darkness. It was an extraordinary gift of survival and progress. The very next thing humans apparently decided to do with this incredible discovery was use it to burn down each other's villages, destroy crops, and wage war. And the same species that figured out how to harness fire immediately pointed it at their neighbors. Some things about human nature have remained remarkably consistent throughout history. 26. King Philip II of Spain assembled the greatest naval fleet the world had ever seen in 1588, called it the Invincible Armada, and sent it sailing toward England with complete confidence that God himself was on Spain's side and victory was basically guaranteed. The Armada ran into an enormous storm in the English Channel that scattered and destroyed a massive portion of the fleet before any serious fighting even began. Philip was told about the disaster and reportedly responded that he had sent his ships to fight men, not storms. He then began planning a second armada which also failed, and then a third which also failed. 27. Tower Records was once the most powerful music retail chain in America, with stores across the country and billions in annual revenue, and they watched the entire music industry shift to digital downloads throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s without doing anything meaningful about it. Napster showed up and millions of Americans started getting music for free online, and Tower Records responded by continuing to sell physical CDs at full price as if nothing was happening. By 2006, the company was over $200 million in debt and filed for bankruptcy. Every single Tower Records store in America closed permanently because they refused to accept that the world had changed. 28. NASA in 1999 launched the Mars Climate Orbiter on a $327 million mission to study the Martian atmosphere and weather patterns after years of planning, engineering, and preparation. When the spacecraft finally reached Mars, it came in at completely the wrong angle and burned up in the atmosphere, destroying the entire mission instantly. The reason was almost unbelievably simple. One engineering team at NASA had been sending navigation data using metric units while another team was reading that data in imperial units. Nobody caught the mismatch for months. A $327 million spacecraft was lost because two teams of rocket scientists forgot to agree on whether they were using miles or kilometers. 29. Emperor Nero was one of the most powerful men on Earth in 64 AD, ruling over the entire Roman Empire from his palace in Rome, when a massive fire broke out and began burning through the city for 6 days straight. According to multiple historical accounts, Nero was not organizing emergency relief or directing firefighting efforts during this crisis. He was allegedly performing music, possibly playing an instrument, and singing while his capital city burned around him. Whether completely true or exaggerated by his enemies, the story stuck because it was so perfectly on brand for Nero, a man who had already murdered his own mother and ruled with spectacular self-involvement. 30. Someone at the snooze and alarm clock company in 1956 invented the snooze button and attached it to alarm clocks across America, creating a small button that does absolutely nothing except delay the inevitable by 9 minutes while actively making you more tired through a process called sleep inertia. Sleep scientists have since explained clearly that hitting snooze repeatedly breaks your sleep cycle, makes you groggier, and actually makes waking up harder than if you had just gotten up the first time. Despite this being widely known, Americans hit the snooze button billions of times every single morning, choosing to be late and exhausted over just setting the alarm 9 minutes later like a rational person. 31. Baghdad in the 13th century was home to the House of Wisdom, the greatest center of knowledge and learning in the entire medieval world, containing hundreds of thousands of books, manuscripts, and scientific texts covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and countless other fields that represented centuries of human intellectual progress. In 1258, the Mongol army under Hulagu Khan arrived, conquered the city, and threw virtually the entire contents of the library into the Tigris River. Witnesses said the river ran black with ink for days. Centuries of accumulated human knowledge was destroyed in a matter of days because a conquering army saw books as worthless, and burning things was easier than reading them. 32. Yahoo in 2008 was one of the most visited websites on the entire internet, a genuine giant of the early digital world with hundreds of millions of users and enormous brand recognition across the globe. But Microsoft looked at Yahoo and decided it was worth $44.6 billion and made a formal offer to buy the entire company at a significant premium over its stock price. Yahoo's board looked at $44.6 billion, thought about it, and said no thank you. They believed Yahoo was worth considerably more and that they could grow it independently. Yahoo slowly collapsed over the following years, was eventually sold to Verizon in 2017 for approximately $4.5 billion, and about 10 times less than Microsoft had offered. 33. Canadian hospitals in the 1980s used a radiation therapy machine called the Therac 25 to treat cancer patients, and it was considered a significant technological advancement over older models. The software controlling the machine had a serious bug that under specific conditions caused it to deliver radiation doses hundreds of times higher than intended, essentially turning a cancer treatment machine into something that could fatally overdose patients with radiation. Operators reported errors, but the company initially dismissed the reports. At least 6 patients were severely injured or killed before the full extent of the problem was understood. The disaster happened largely because the software had never been properly tested and warning signs were ignored for far too long. 34. Roman Emperor Valens in 378 AD found himself facing a large Gothic army that had crossed into Roman territory and was causing serious problems along the empire's border. His allies offered him additional reinforcements and military support before he engaged the enemy, which would have given him a significant numerical and strategic advantage going into battle. Valens refused the help because he did not want to share the glory of what he expected to be an easy victory. He attacked the Gothic forces at the Battle of Adrianople without waiting for reinforcements, was completely overwhelmed, and died on the battlefield along with most of his army. Military historians widely consider this one of the key moments that began the irreversible collapse of the Western Roman Empire. 35. Humans invented plastic in the early 20th century and immediately recognized it as an extraordinary material because it was cheap, durable, lightweight, and could be shaped into virtually anything. They put it in everything: oceans of single-use plastic bags, bottles, packaging, straws, containers, and countless other products designed to be used once and thrown away. The small problem nobody seriously addressed for decades was that plastic essentially never breaks down and just accumulates forever in landfills, oceans, rivers, and soil. Scientists eventually found microplastics inside fish, inside drinking water, and inside human blood. By the time the world started paying attention, plastic was quite literally everywhere on Earth, with no realistic way to get rid of it. 36. France spent years and an enormous amount of money during the 1930s building the Maginot Line, a supposedly impenetrable network of underground fortresses, bunkers, gun emplacements, and tunnels along its border with Germany, specifically designed to stop any German invasion in its tracks. It was a genuine engineering achievement, and France was extremely proud of it. There was, however, one fairly significant issue, which was that the Maginot Line did not extend all the way to the coast, leaving a gap through Belgium and the Ardennes Forest, which military planners considered impassable. Germany walked their entire invasion force directly through that gap in 1940 and conquered France in about 6 weeks, while the Maginot Line sat there completely unused. 37. Quaker Oats in 1994 decided to expand beyond oatmeal and acquired the beverage brand Snapple for $1.7 billion, convinced they could turn the quirky, independent drink company into a mainstream consumer giant. The problem was that Snapple's entire appeal was its weird, lovable, unconventional personality. And the moment a massive corporation took over, they started making exactly the kinds of decisions that stripped all of that away. Distribution deals were restructured badly. Marketing lost the plot entirely, and sales collapsed almost immediately. Quaker Oats sold Snapple just 27 months after buying it for $300 million, absorbing a loss of $1.4 billion in just over 2 years in one of the most spectacular corporate disasters in American business history. 38. For most of the 20th century, asbestos was considered a wonder material, used in insulation, flooring, ceiling tiles, pipe wrapping, brake pads, and even cigarette filters, although showing up in homes, schools, hospitals, and workplaces across America. Companies manufacturing and selling asbestos products had internal documents as early as the 1930s showing their own researchers had linked asbestos exposure to serious lung disease. They buried those findings, fought regulation for decades, and continued selling the product widely. By the time asbestos was widely restricted in America, tens of thousands of people had developed mesothelioma and other fatal lung conditions, and buildings across the country still contain asbestos that requires expensive professional removal to this day. 39. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia spent the years leading up to 1917 collecting an almost impressive number of warning signs that his reign was heading toward catastrophic collapse. His own advisors warned him. Massive protests erupted in the streets. Russia was losing a devastating war. His own government was barely functioning. Millions of ordinary Russians were starving. Nicholas responded to all of this by resisting meaningful political reform, clinging to absolute power and taking personal command of military failures he was completely unqualified to fix. When the Russian Revolution finally came, it swept away not just his throne but his entire family. Historians generally agree he had more than enough chances to change course and chose not to take a single one. 40. After World War II, American cities had an extraordinary opportunity to rebuild and redesign urban spaces from scratch, and the decision they collectively made was to organize everything around the automobile. Highways were bulldozed directly through existing neighborhoods, public transit was defunded or dismantled entirely, and cities were literally redesigned so that a car was not a convenience but an absolute necessity for daily life. Suburbs sprawled outward for miles with no walkable amenities, no bike infrastructure, and no realistic alternatives to driving. Decades later, Americans were spending enormous portions of their income on car ownership, sitting in traffic for hours daily, and wondering why their cities felt isolating, expensive, and impossible to navigate without a vehicle. 41. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, and the whole tragic event almost did not happen at all. His motorcade had already survived one assassination attempt earlier that same day, and was driving away safely when his driver took a wrong turn down a narrow street and had to stop to reverse. Gavrilo Princip, one of the assassins who had already given up and was buying a sandwich nearby, looked up and found his target stopped directly in front of him. One wrong turn by a confused driver started a chain of events that killed 17 million people. 42. In 1962, a small British record label called Decca auditioned a young band from Liverpool and decided to pass on signing them. The executive who made the decision famously explained his reasoning by saying guitar groups are on their way out, and this band had no future in show business. That band was the Beatles. Decca signed Brian Poole and the Tremolos instead, a group almost nobody remembers today. The Beatles went on to become the most successful and influential music act in human history, and that Decca executive's quote became one of the most embarrassing predictions anyone in the music industry has ever made. 43. Ford Motor Company in the early 1970s conducted internal crash tests on their new budget car, the Pinto, and discovered that the fuel tank had a serious design flaw that caused it to rupture and catch fire in rear-end collisions. Engineers identified a fix that would have cost approximately $11 per vehicle. Ford's executives ran the numbers, calculated that paying lawsuit settlements for burn victims would be cheaper than fixing every car, and made the deliberate decision to sell the vehicle anyway. The Pinto went on sale with the known defect. People were killed and burned in fires that Ford had already accounted for in a spreadsheet. 44. Mao Zedong in 1958 decided that sparrows were eating too much grain and declared war on them as part of his Great Leap Forward campaign, mobilizing hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens to kill every sparrow they could find. People banged drums, waved flags, and chased birds continuously until they dropped from exhaustion. The sparrow population was effectively wiped out. What nobody had accounted for was that sparrows also ate locusts. Without sparrows, the locust population exploded completely unchecked, devoured crops across the country on a massive scale, and contributed directly to a famine that killed an estimated 15 to 55 million people. 45. Scientists understood the basic mechanics of human-caused climate change as far back as the 1890s, and by the 1980s, major oil companies had their own internal research confirming that burning fossil fuels was warming the planet with potentially catastrophic consequences. ExxonMobil's own scientists produced detailed, accurate climate models that matched almost exactly what happened decades later. The company then spent millions funding organizations designed to cast doubt on that same science. Decades of international summits, agreements, and pledges followed. Emissions kept rising anyway. The world essentially had 40 years of clear warning, chose economic convenience over action, and is now dealing with the entirely predictable consequences. 46. Rome defeated Carthage in 146 BC. after years of brutal warfare. And when Roman forces finally took the city, their response went well beyond military victory. They burned Carthage to the ground and sold the surviving population into slavery, and according to widespread historical accounts, salted the surrounding agricultural fields to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. The goal was total and permanent erasure. It worked almost completely. Carthage essentially ceased to exist as a civilization, and the region that was once fertile farmland became increasingly arid over time. Rome was so committed to destroying their enemy that they turned productive land into a desert just to make absolutely sure. 47. In 1980, Atari was the dominant force in the entire video game and home computing industry, with enormous resources, massive market share, and a position of almost unassailable strength in the technology world. IBM approached Atari about licensing an operating system for their new personal computer project, and Atari passed on the deal. IBM then went to a tiny little company called Microsoft, which had recently acquired a small operating system and was very happy to make a deal. That operating system became MS-DOS, the foundation Microsoft built its entire empire on. Atari's decision to pass handed Microsoft the opportunity that turned Bill Gates into one of the wealthiest humans in history. 48. When workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine in April 1986 were conducting a routine safety test designed to check whether the reactor could be kept cool during a power outage. The test had been postponed multiple times. The overnight crew running it was not fully briefed. Safety protocols were bypassed to keep the test on schedule, and several warning systems were deliberately disabled. Within seconds of the test beginning, the reactor went completely out of control and exploded in the worst nuclear disaster in human history. The safety test meant to prove the plant was safe caused the exact catastrophic meltdown it was supposed to prevent. 49. Emperor Caligula ruled Rome for about 4 years in the 1st century AD and packed an extraordinary amount of bizarre behavior into that relatively short reign. But his single most spectacular decision was appointing his horse Incitatus to the position of Roman consul, one of the highest offices in the entire empire. Caligula reportedly gave the horse a marble stable, an ivory stall, jeweled collars, and a staff of servants. Some historians debate whether this was genuine madness or a deliberate insult to the Roman Senate, essentially telling them a horse could do their jobs just as well. Either way, Rome had reached a point where a horse held political office and nobody could do anything about it. So there you have it, 49 of the most spectacularly dumb decisions humans have ever made. And somehow civilization is still standing, which is honestly the most surprising part of all this. If any of these made you question everything you thought you knew about human intelligence, go ahead and hit that like button because you owe it to every person in this video who clearly made terrible choices, so you did not have to. Subscribe to BrainFumble and turn on notifications because we find this stuff so you never have to feel alone in a world full of bad decisions. Now tell us down in the comments, which one of these 49 decisions do you think was the absolute dumbest of them all?